what's the level of transfer when teaching to concept versus label or skill? So as mentioned throughout, multiple teachers mentioned focusing on concepts over practices. In music education, which is what my background is in, we'd often refer to concept over label. So for example, we might say amplitude or volume or gain or dynamic to indicate how loud or soft something is. But those are all labels for the concept that things can be loud, soft, or anywhere in between. As another example, we would often have musicians transfer from one instrument or device to another instrument or device for making music. And to be honest, the transfer wasn't a big concern among music educators in terms of like the negative effects of, oh, well, if they learn saxophone fingering and then they transfer over to clarinet, they're not going to sound as good. Well, yeah, they're learning a completely different instrument. It's assumed that you're going to need to practice it. So if you go from a saxophone to a clarinet, you're going to have to relearn some things, and it's assumed, yeah, it's going to take some time to retrain your muscle memory. And if you jump back and forth between the different instruments, your brain might mix them up sometimes. That happened to me when I was teaching those instruments. That's to be expected. It's not like oh, wow, I'm so surprised. You went from playing marimba to playing vibraphone and it doesn't sound as good. Well, yeah, that's because it's different techniques, different setups, different contexts, different styles, or syntax, if you will, etc. For whatever reason, computer science educators seem to get hung up on, oh, well, when you transfer from one language to another, it's not one-to-one. And I don't know why that would ever be expected, in my opinion. Like, I went from using a video editing software to a different one, and the concepts are all the same, but they have different features, they have different ways of doing things, and they sometimes use different labels for the same concept, like rendering versus exporting versus bouncing, etc. All of those basically mean, hey, I want to take this project and turn it into a video that I want to share. But you have to learn the different labels, basically the different syntax, the different ways of engaging with that platform. And it's the same thing for a programming language. But to argue with myself, it's not just conceptual, it's also skill-based. So here's an example that's very specific to my nerdiness. If you go to my website, you'll notice that I have computer science content, but I also have drumming content and then gaming content. If you've watched any of the videos of gaming, you'll know that I have gone from years of playing controller on a game like Fortnite. And then I switched over to keyboard and mouse. And even though I understand all of the same concepts, it's the same game, I know I'm supposed to aim, I know how to interact with things, I know I'm supposed to build, it's a completely different set of mechanics, different fingers, different motions, etc. And it really messed me up. Even though conceptually I get it, my brain's like, wait, what's the button for this thing? Same thing for syntax in a programming language. If you're not used to adding in curly braces or semicolons, and you're instead used to indentation and not needing semicolons, you're going to have to basically develop the skill or the habit of putting in curly braces and semicolons and other syntax variations, etc. So yeah, there's a conceptual thing that we need to focus on, but we also need to focus on just the habits and understand that mistakes will happen, like learning when you transfer from one language to another. And that's, quite frankly, okay. We don't want to just learn the concepts. We want to apply those understandings through a program or a project or something that we create and can do with those concepts. Otherwise, what's the point of learning it? You're not going to use it in some way. But I'm also curious about okay, well, how does the transfer from and between higher or lower languages impact understanding? So my own guess is that it is easier to transfer from a lower level language to a higher level language than the other way around. So if you're not familiar with the terminology, lower level language would be something like C++. It's very syntax heavy. There's a lot of things you need to worry about in terms of basically the grammar of your code in order to make sure that things work. It's lower in that it more resembles machine code. If you transfer from that to a higher level language, which is syntax light, it looks more like writing out sentences than it does like code. My guess is that would be easier because you're going, oh, I don't need all that extra stuff. But if you go the other way around, and you go from something that's light on syntax to something that is heavier on syntax, my guess is you would forget things, and it would be an inconvenience and a frustration rather than the other way around where it's like, oh, this is so much easier. However, it is a lot easier to start with a higher level language that is syntax light than something that is a lower level language. So it's kind of like a catch there, where it's like, do I want to make it easier for the transfer or easier to begin? And I don't really have a good answer for that. And that kind of transfers into the next question that I have. So what's the line between motivation to learn and effectiveness of an approach used to transfer understandings? So for example, Instructional designers often talk about minimizing cognitive load to make it so that it's the most efficient way to learn something. But often in instructional design approaches, it assumes an inherent and equal motivation among the participants. And it doesn't really talk about how some students are there to learn and others don't care, especially if they're required to be there. So in my opinion, it really matters who is initiating this transfer of language, as it can have a profound impact on whether or not somebody's willing to make the transfer, as some of the teachers mentioned. Some students just want to stick with their original language. Like, if I had a kid who is like really into video gaming and I'm like, all right, class, we're going to start learning Sonic Pi, they're probably going to put up some resistance and go, I want to stick with Scratch and just make video games. I don't want to code music, which is the only thing you can do in Sonic Pi. So when transferring from one language to another, I left it up to students to make that decision. This was much more difficult to teach because if there are 30 students in the class, they'd be working on 30 different projects in several different languages simultaneously. So again, I had to quickly shift from one language to the next when I would be walking by and assessing their code and look for potential problems or bugs, or when I'd be providing some questions for them to think through to try and help guide them towards some kind of an understanding or to solving a problem, etc. It also made it harder in terms of not being able to find as many peers. If there are 30 kids in the class all working on the same language, it's a whole lot easier to say, hey, talk to the person next to you, see if they can help out. But if the people on either side of you are working on a completely different language or different platform, that makes that conversation a little bit harder. So as much as I love the motivation side of things and really focusing on that to determine whether you can transfer, there is this like fine line between when should you and when should you not do the transfer. And really it's up to you and the kids that you're working with, in my opinion. Can't give a blanket statement of this is when you absolutely should or should not do it. But that's my own epistemology. This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 130. It's titled Teachers' Views on Experiences on Teaching Second and Subsequent Programming Languages.